Before we begin the horror show, tell me where you're from. Drop your city name in the comments, and if there's a creepy story tied to it, I'll make sure to feature it in a future video. Your city's frightful past could be the next to terrorize us all.
Story number 1. The air was crisp as David and Lena drove away from the bustle of the city, their car cutting through the smooth roads that wound towards the heart of the countryside. They had been planning this hiking trip for weeks, eager to spend time together in nature, away from the distractions of daily life. A newlywed couple, only married for a few weeks. Their life together was still fresh with the excitement of new beginnings. The world felt full of possibilities. As they neared the edge of the forest, the landscape around them began to change. The green fields gave way to towering trees, their branches like skeletal arms reaching toward the sky. The forest loomed ahead, dark and silent, as though it was watching them. A strange sense of anticipation filled the air, as if the forest itself had been waiting for them to arrive. David, ever the skeptic, broke the silence as he glanced at the dense woods. "It looks a little foreboding, doesn't it?" His voice was light, but there was a hint of unease. Lena, always the adventurous one, grinned. "Don't be such a worrywart. It's just a forest. People hike through here all the time. We'll be fine." They parked the car at a small clearing near the entrance to the woods, the tires crunching over the gravel. As Lena reached for her backpack, she noticed an old man sitting on a bench by the side of the road, watching them intently. His clothes were weathered, his face lined with age, and his eyes seemed to carry a knowledge that made her uncomfortable. David, noticing the man as well, gave a casual wave, but the old man didn't return the gesture. Instead, he stood up slowly, his joints creaking, and ambled toward them. His expression was serious, even grim. "Are you planning on going into the forest?" he asked, his voice rasping as though he hadn't spoken in years. "Yeah," David replied with a smile. "We're just going to hike for a bit, maybe spend the night." The old man's eyes seemed to widen slightly, his gaze flicking to the trees behind them. "You shouldn't go in," he said, his voice low and thick with a warning. "That place, it changes you. People who enter, they don't come out the same if they come out at all." Lena laughed softly, brushing it off. "You don't have to worry about us. We'll be fine." The old man took a step closer, his gaze fixed on them. "I'm serious. Time doesn't work like it should there. Some say it moves faster, others say it doesn't move at all. People age years in the span of minutes or regress. I've seen it. I've watched it happen." His voice cracked with emotion, and for a moment there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. David looked at Lena, who gave a playful shrug. "It's just some local superstition," she said with a wink, trying to make light of the situation. "We'll be fine. We'll take our time, maybe set up camp, and head back tomorrow. What's the worst that could happen?" The old man didn't respond immediately. He just stared at them, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to come from the very core of him. "There's always a price to pay," he muttered, his voice tinged with regret. "The forest takes what it wants." With that, he turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Lena and David stood in silence for a moment, the tension from the brief encounter lingering in the air. David shook his head, half smiling. People love telling tall tales in small towns. I bet he's just trying to scare us. Lena didn't answer immediately. She felt a strange unease, a creeping sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. She looked toward the dark forest, where the trees seemed to watch them with ancient eyes, and for a fleeting moment she wondered if the old man's words held any truth. But then she dismissed it. "Let's not waste any more time. We've got an adventure to start." With that, they grabbed their gear and set off into the forest, leaving the old man and his cryptic warnings behind them. As Lena and David ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew thick and heavy, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The once chirping birds fell silent, leaving only the crunch of their boots on the fallen leaves as the backdrop. The path they followed had long since vanished, swallowed by the dense underbrush and creeping vines. It felt as though the forest itself had no intention of letting them leave. David looked around, his eyes narrowing. It feels like the forest is different, don't you think? Like we're being watched. Lena smiled, brushing off his unease. You're just imagining things. It's probably just how isolated we are out here. Nature has its way of making everything feel a bit. But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were eerily silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. There was no sign of wildlife, no sounds of squirrels scampering or birds calling to one another. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. The further they walked, the more the landscape seemed to warp. The trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and twisted, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long, even though it was still midday. There was something unsettling about the way the light barely filtered through the canopy, as if the sun's rays were being devoured by the darkness above. We should have turned back, David muttered, his voice taut with nervousness. This doesn't feel right. Maybe we should just head back to the car. Lena glanced at him, her brow furrowed. We can't turn back now. We've come this far. Besides, the forest doesn't look that bad. But David's unease continued to gnaw at him, growing with every step. It wasn't just the shadows or the silence. It was something more, something invisible, something that seemed to wrap itself around his thoughts like a vice, pressing tighter with each passing second. After what felt like hours of trudging through the thick undergrowth, they came across something unexpected, an abandoned campsite. Tents lay torn and half collapsed, and rotting food sat untouched, its smell faint but still pungent in the air. The sight of the decaying remains made Lena's stomach turn. What happened here? She asked, kneeling beside a half-eaten loaf of bread, covered in a thin layer of mold. David didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on something else. Near the edge of the campsite, partially buried under a pile of fallen branches, was a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He picked it up carefully, brushing off the dirt and debris, and opened it to the first page. Lena peered over his shoulder as he began to read aloud, his voice quiet and hesitant. Day 1. We've just entered the forest, and the air feels strange. The locals warned us, but we thought they were just trying to scare us. Time seems to pass differently here. We thought it was just the isolation making our senses dull. But it's not just that. Day 2. Something is wrong. Our watches are all malfunctioning. The sun doesn't seem to move across the sky like it should. I feel older somehow, more tired than I should. Am I imagining it? Day 3. It's getting worse. The forest isn't like other woods. I've heard whispers, but I can't understand them. The others are feeling it too. Some of us have started to regress, feeling younger. I can feel it happening to me. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. David stopped reading, his voice trembling. He turned to Lena, his face pale. This is insane. People have been in here before, and they age or get younger. This doesn't make sense. Lena took the diary from his hands, scanning the next pages quickly. The entries became increasingly frantic. There were drawings of the forest's dense trees and strange symbols that seemed to pulse off the page, as if they were alive. Some entries were written in a wild, barely legible scrawl, while others were marked with dates, though none seemed to follow any logical pattern. Day 5. I'm losing track of time. I swear it's only been hours, but my body feels older, like decades have passed in a single afternoon. The others are growing younger. It's terrifying. I hear laughter now, distant but growing louder. We have to get out. Day 6. We can't leave. There's no way out. The forest, it changes things. Time doesn't work the same way here. I can feel myself slipping away, my past slipping away. The children are coming. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The children? What does that mean? David glanced nervously around the campsite, his eyes darting to the trees, as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. We need to go. Now. But Lena stood frozen, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. The last few entries were much worse. It's not just time, she whispered, her voice strained. The forest, it's feeding on them. It's taking something from them. They're vanishing. Completely. The final entry was smeared, as though written in haste, the ink blotched as if the writer had been trying to escape. They want us. I can hear them. The forest is alive and it wants our time. It doesn't care if we leave. We will vanish. We are nothing. Time is nothing here. The children, they've come for us. I can feel them on my skin, like thorns. David closed the diary with a snap, his hands shaking. We need to leave. Now this isn't some old legend. Something's happening to us. But as he turned to leave, Lena noticed something strange. The air around them seemed to pulse, like a living thing. She glanced at David and saw him rubbing his eyes, as though he were waking from a fog. His face seemed younger. David? She asked, a sharp edge of panic creeping into her voice. David, are you okay? David didn't respond at first. He just blinked and looked at her, his expression confused. I feel weird, he said slowly. Like I'm not sure what's going on, but I feel strange. Like I'm younger. Lena's heart dropped. No, this can't be happening. We need to get out of here right now. But the path they had followed to the campsite had disappeared. There was no sign of the road, no trail to lead them back. The forest had swallowed it all, and the world beyond the trees seemed like a distant, unreachable dream. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, a chilling thought settled in Lena's mind. The forest wasn't just messing with their perception of time, it was feeding on them, and the deeper they went, the harder it would be to escape. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as she looked at David, his face now almost unrecognizable. It wasn't just the strange feeling of aging or growing younger. It was the fact that he was visibly changing. His features, which had once seemed so familiar, now appeared softer, less defined, almost childlike. His jawline, once sharp and adult, had softened into something more youthful, more innocent. David, this isn't happening, Lena whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out to grab his arm, but her hand brushed against his skin and recoiled in horror. His skin felt smooth, almost too smooth, like that of a child, and his once sturdy muscles had begun to lose their tone. Hey, don't freak out, David said, his voice a strange mix of confusion and discomfort. He looked down at himself, frowning. It's like I'm seeing myself from the outside. Lena stepped back, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This is not a joke, David. We need to find a way out of here, right now. But as she scanned the forest around them, the trees seemed to close in even tighter, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, their shadows growing longer and more twisted. The path they had followed had disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but a dense, impenetrable forest in every direction. Suddenly, a noise broke through the thick silence, a faint, high-pitched giggle. It sounded distant at first, like a child's laughter carried on the wind, but it was followed by another and another, until the laughter seemed to surround them, echoing in the trees. Lena froze, her blood running cold. What the hell is that? David turned toward her, his wide eyes full of confusion. It's just some kids playing in the woods, right? But Lena could hear the difference. This laughter wasn't innocent. It wasn't playful. It was mocking, sinister, like the laughter of something not entirely human. It sent a chill racing up her spine, and her grip on her backpack tightened instinctively. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. There's something wrong here. We're not alone. David took a step forward, squinting into the shadows. The trees were thick here, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves, but the laughter didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, closer, until it was no longer coming from the distance, but from right behind them. Lena spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she searched the trees for any sign of movement. But the forest was still, too still. The only sound was that eerie, childlike giggle, which seemed to grow more frantic, more unsettling by the second. And then, nothing. Silence. David and Lena stood motionless, the air between them thick with fear. They exchanged a glance, neither of them willing to speak the words that lingered on their lips. What if it's not just the forest? The silence stretched, suffocating, until the laughter came again. But this time it was louder, almost deafening, right behind them. The sound seemed to surge from all directions, bouncing off the trees and reverberating in their skulls, as if it was coming from something unseen, something just beyond their sight. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she turned to see nothing, except for something else. A figure, standing in the distance, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. At first she thought it might have been a trick of the light, the way the shadows played, but as her eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. A child, or rather, a thing that resembled a child. Its figure was small and frail, hunched unnaturally at the shoulders. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like two small embers flickering in the black void. Its face was pale, almost skeletal, with sharp, uneven features that twisted into a cruel smile. Lena gasped, taking a step backward. "David, do you see that?" David didn't respond at first. His gaze was fixed on the figure in the distance, his face pale, his eyes wide. The laughter, now seeming to come from the very air around them, grew louder, more frantic, as though the figure in the shadows was feeding on it, drawing power from it. The childlike figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its limbs moving in an unnatural way, like it was being puppeteered by some unseen force. The faint glow from its eyes intensified, casting an eerie light across its skeletal face. And then, in a voice that sent chills straight to their bones, it spoke. "Play with us," it whispered, its voice high and shrill like the wind itself had taken form. "You're young, like us now. Don't you want to play?" Lena stumbled backward, her heart racing. "What? What do you want from us?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. The laughter of the other children seemed to blend with its voice, becoming one, creating a chorus of mocking, haunting sounds. "They always play," the figure hissed, its grin stretching impossibly wide. "But some of them stay. Some of them stay forever." David's voice quivered, his earlier confidence gone. No, we're leaving. We're leaving now." Lena grabbed his arm, tugging him urgently. "We can't go that way. We can't." But before she could finish, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. The earth groaned, as if the very forest was alive, responding to the figure's words. The trees around them creaked, their branches twisting and curling, reaching out like tendrils, as if trying to pull them into the heart of the forest. The figure in the distance smiled wider, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You can't leave. The forest keeps what it wants. And we want you." Without warning, the childlike figure lunged forward, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, as though it were some kind of shadow, only partially tethered to the earth. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the figure disappeared into the shadows, its laughter ringing in her ears. David and Lena turned to run, but the path was gone, swallowed up by the thick forest. The trees were closing in on them, their branches blocking every escape, pulling them back, tightening around them like a vice. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the laughter stopped. The forest was still, too still. Lena's mind raced, "What is this place?" she whispered. David looked at her, his face pale and haunted. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But we're not leaving. Not the way we came in." The air around them grew thick, oppressive, and the silence that followed the laughter hung like a shroud over the forest. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig beneath their feet seemed amplified, as though the forest was listening to their every move. The trees, gnarled and twisted, seemed to lean in, their roots creeping along the forest floor like fingers grasping for them. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as they stumbled forward, her legs aching from the effort of running and the strange weight that seemed to press down on her body. Her thoughts were frantic, swirling with fear and confusion. What was this place? What did that thing mean? Stay forever? Her grip tightened on David's arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his jacket, as if holding on to him was the only thing keeping her grounded in reality. David, his face pale and drawn, kept his eyes fixed ahead, but he seemed to be growing smaller. Not physically, but in the way his presence had become less distinct. She had to focus hard to keep her attention on him. The further they went into the forest, the more he seemed to fade. "David, we're not getting out of here, are we?" Lena's voice cracked, the weight of their situation pressing down on her chest like a vice. David didn't answer immediately. His face was a mix of confusion and fear, his youthful features becoming more pronounced as the minutes ticked by. It was as if the forest was unraveling time itself, pulling them into some otherworldly vortex where nothing, no one, remained the same. "I don't know," he finally muttered, his voice smaller now, distant. "It feels like I'm forgetting who I am." Lena's eyes widened, and she spun to face him. His voice was different, too. The fear was still there, but it was tinged with something else. Something lighter, more innocent, like the voice of a child who didn't understand the danger around them. "David, stop it. This isn't real. We can't let it take us." But it was already too late. The ground beneath them trembled, and a deep, resonant thrum pulsed through the air, sending vibrations up their spines. The trees, the very forest itself, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. And then, the silence shattered. A low, guttural sound rose from the earth, like the groan of something ancient and powerful. A massive shadow loomed ahead, emerging from the thick mist that had begun to swirl around their feet. It was enormous, towering over them, and as it emerged into the clearing, Lena gasped. Before them stood the tree. It was no ordinary tree. The trunk was wide, its bark twisted in strange, intricate patterns, like veins pulsating with life. Its branches stretched high into the sky, black and gnarled, with leaves that seemed to glisten like dark, oily feathers. The tree seemed to breathe, each inhale sending ripples through the air, as if it were alive, watching them, judging them. The thrum from deep within its core grew louder, more intense, and the very air around them seemed to warp with each beat. It was like the tree was alive with time itself, a being that had existed for centuries, feeding on those who ventured too close, bending the very fabric of time to its will. "Is that the heart of the forest?" Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. David nodded, his eyes wide with awe and terror. "I think it is. It's what controls everything here. All the time, all the people. It's all connected to this tree." Lena's mind raced. This was the source of the anomaly, the thing that had twisted their perceptions of time and pulled them into its web. A voice echoed in her mind, distant but clear. "One of you must stay. One of you must be the offering." She turned to David, her heart breaking as she saw him shrink further before her eyes. His features were softening, becoming childlike once again. The forest was claiming him. It was pulling him back into the past, into oblivion. "David!" she cried, her voice trembling with desperation. "We can't let this happen. We have to go together. Please." David's gaze locked onto hers, his face a mask of sorrow. "Lena, I'm not sure I can hold on anymore." His voice cracked, now that of a child, his body nearly transformed back to its youthful state. "The forest, it's too strong. I don't think I can get out of here without—" Before he could finish, the tree's pulse quickened, and a loud, booming voice filled the air. "One of you must stay. It is the price of time. The forest has chosen." Lena recoiled, her hands shaking as she reached for him. She could feel the pull now, the overwhelming weight of the forest's will pressing down on her. The thrum of the tree grew louder, filling her entire being with a sense of dread and inevitability. "No," she sobbed. "No, I won't leave you." But David, now little more than a child in her arms, smiled faintly. It was the smile of someone who had given in to the inevitable. His voice, weak but clear, was full of acceptance. "I love you, Lena. You have to go. You have to escape. Don't let it take both of us." And in that moment, Lena realized what she had to do. The forest had already taken David, his life, his time, his essence. He was slipping away, caught in the forest's cruel grip, and nothing she could do would change that. But she still had a chance. The tree had offered her a way out, but only at the cost of leaving behind a piece of herself. Her hands trembling, Lena kissed David's forehead, whispering a final goodbye. "I love you too, David. I'm so sorry." As the ancient tree's pulsating rhythm grew louder, she stepped back, away from him, her heart shattering with each step. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the smell of time itself unraveling, but she forced herself to turn and run. The moment she did, she felt a strange tugging at her soul, as if the forest itself was trying to pull her back. The path in front of her seemed to stretch impossibly long, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her mind was consumed with one thought: escape. And then, just as she reached the edge of the forest, the world seemed to shift. Time itself snapped back into place, and the oppressive, eerie feeling of the forest faded. She stood at the edge of a field, the sun just beginning to set behind distant hills. The air was clear, crisp and free of the choking weight of the forest. Lena gasped, clutching her chest as she realized she was no longer in the forest. The timeline, the horrors, the twisted time loop, it was gone. She had escaped. But as she looked back over her shoulder, the image of David's fading face lingered in her mind. And in the back of her mind, the voice of the forest whispered, "You cannot escape time." Years passed, and Lena moved on with her life. She married again, found peace, and had children. But there was always a part of her that could not forget the forest, the heart of it, the tree, and the cost of escaping. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she would hear a faint, childlike laugh in the wind. And every time her heart would skip a beat, knowing that, deep down, she had left something behind. She had left someone behind. And somewhere, deep in the forest that ate time, the tree pulsed with life, and the laughter of those who had stayed echoed through the ages. Story number 2. The car rumbled down the narrow, winding dirt road that led toward the entrance of the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching out from the shadows. The sun was beginning its descent behind the distant mountains, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, as if the forest itself were holding its breath in anticipation. The group of friends sat in uneasy silence, their anticipation mingling with the unease that seemed to settle in the air. Emma, who had always been the cautious one, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced nervously out of the window, the dark trees stretching endlessly on either side of the road. She had heard the stories, of course, the rumors whispered in hushed tones by the locals of strange occurrences in the woods. But she had dismissed them as just that, stories. Tall tales spun by people who had too much time on their hands. But as the car bounced along the rugged trail, Emma couldn't deny that a sense of foreboding had settled over her like a heavy cloak. She looked over at Ben, her boyfriend, who sat beside her, his face a mixture of excitement and quiet concern. Ben was the adventurous type, always eager to explore the unknown, but even he seemed to notice the weight of the atmosphere. "Hey, are you all right?" Ben asked, his voice breaking the silence. He reached over and gently squeezed her hand, his grip reassuring but not entirely dispelling the unease in her chest. "Yeah, I'm fine," Emma replied with a forced smile, though her voice trembled ever so slightly. "Just, I don't know. Something feels off about this place." Ben frowned, glancing out the window at the looming trees. "It's just the forest. It's supposed to feel mysterious. That's half the fun, right?" Emma nodded, but her gut told her that this was more than just a sense of adventure. It was something deeper, something primal, something that had been waiting for them. Behind them, Sarah and Ryan were talking animatedly, their voices a stark contrast to the tension that seemed to hang in the air. Sarah, the quiet artist, had always been the one to seek out the strange and unexplained. She thrived on mystery and the unknown. Ryan, the joker of the group, was less concerned with the ominous atmosphere. He cracked jokes to lighten the mood, his infectious laugh carrying through the car. "Man, we're gonna have the best time," Ryan declared, his voice full of enthusiasm. "Just think about it. No phones, no distractions, just us in the great outdoors." Sarah smirked. "Yeah, except for the part where you're probably gonna get us lost in the woods with no way out." Ryan laughed. "We'll be fine. I've got a great sense of direction. It's all part of the adventure." Lily, who had been unusually quiet up until now, stared out the window with a thoughtful expression on her face. She was Ben's twin sister, and though she was often the more practical and grounded of the two, she was also known for her no-nonsense attitude. She had grown up hearing stories about the forest, stories from locals who spoke in hushed tones, their faces shadowed with fear whenever they mentioned the ancient woods. But Lily wasn't the type to believe in folklore and superstition. Still, a flicker of doubt gnawed at her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this trip was different. When the car finally came to a stop, they all piled out, stretching their legs and breathing in the crisp, cool air. The forest stood before them like an ancient temple, its towering trees casting long, foreboding shadows across the clearing. There was something unnervingly still about it, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. "All right, guys," Ben said, his voice light but with a hint of excitement. "We're here. Time to get set up." They unloaded their gear and began setting up camp in a small clearing just off the main trail. The ground was soft with moss, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. The quiet was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt peaceful, almost surreal, but to Emma, it was anything but peaceful. As they worked, Emma kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes drawn to the trees that seemed to loom closer, their shadows thickening as the sun sank lower in the sky. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on them, as if it were alive, watching them, waiting for them to make the first move. "Maybe we should set up closer to the fire pit," she suggested, trying to push away the sense of unease that was creeping up her spine. Ben looked at her, his brow furrowed in concern. "Emma, you're getting weirdly paranoid. It's just a forest. We're fine." I know," Emma replied, forcing a smile. "But something about this place, it doesn't feel right." Ben chuckled, though his laugh sounded a little forced. All right. If it makes you feel better, we'll set up right next to the fire. I just don't want to hear any complaints later when we're all roasting marshmallows." They finished setting up the tents, and soon enough, a fire was crackling in the center of their little campsite. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the trees around them, the sound of the crackling wood the only thing breaking the silence. They gathered around the fire, passing around a bag of marshmallows, the smell of roasting sugar mixing with the earthy scent of the woods. The group settled into their usual camping routine, telling stories and laughing together. But despite the jovial atmosphere, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. As the night wore on, the air grew colder, and the darkness around them seemed to stretch out infinitely. The forest was vast, its reach beyond anything they could imagine. Emma's mind began to wander, her thoughts returning to the stories she had heard in town. The tales of the skinwalkers who roamed these woods, shapeshifters who could mimic voices and appearances to lure their victims into the forest's heart. She pushed the thought aside. It was just superstition, right? There was no such thing as skinwalkers, just as there was no such thing as ghosts or curses. Still, the deeper they ventured into the forest, the more uneasy Emma became. It wasn't just the stories. It was the way the forest seemed to pulse with something dark and ancient, as though it were alive and waiting. "Hey, Emma," Lily said, breaking her train of thought. "You all right?" Emma blinked, realizing she had been staring into the fire. "Yeah, just thinking." Lily raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. Instead, she grabbed a marshmallow and skewered it with a stick, holding it over the flames. "Well, don't think too hard. We're supposed to be having fun." Emma smiled weakly. "Yeah, fun." But her unease only grew as the night wore on. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows around the campsite. Every now and then she would hear something, a soft rustling in the trees, a whisper in the wind. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The sound of the wind and the crackling fire filled the space, and yet, something was different. The woods felt alive in a way she couldn't explain. The air was heavy, thick with a tension she couldn't name. As the night deepened, the campfire's warmth seemed to fade in the cold air. The once vibrant orange glow of the fire now cast long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. The friends sat around it in an almost unnatural silence, the normal chatter of their camping trip replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves, which Emma couldn't shake the feeling was just a little too deliberate, like the forest was trying to get their attention. Ben stretched out his legs, breaking the silence. "All right, guys, who's up for a hike? The moon's full tonight, and it looks amazing out there." Lily gave him a skeptical look. "We're already deep in the woods, Ben. Are you sure it's safe to go further?" Ben grinned, his eyes sparkling with that familiar mischievous glint. "It's not that far. Just a quick walk. We'll be back before we know it. Plus, we can check out that old ruin everyone in town keeps talking about." Ryan, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly perked up at the mention of an old ruin. "Wait, you mean the one near the creek? I've heard the rumors about that place. It's supposed to be haunted. But hey, if we're looking for a scare, let's go. I'm down." Sarah laughed, her voice light. "Are we really going to follow Ryan into some creepy ruins at night? That sounds like a horror movie." Ryan just shrugged. "Look, the best stories come from the weirdest experiences. Besides, I'll bet the ruins are just a bunch of rocks. What could go wrong?" Emma's stomach tightened, her thoughts returning to the rumors she had heard about the forest. It wasn't just the woods that were dangerous, it was what lurked within them. Skinwalkers, shapeshifters who could mimic voices and appearances to lure victims into the dark, were said to haunt this place. She had dismissed the stories earlier, thinking they were nothing but local superstition, but now she wasn't so sure. "Ben, I really don't think we should," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. Ben gave her a soft smile, his hand resting gently on hers. "Come on, Em. You're just overthinking things. I promise we'll be back soon, and everything will be fine." Lily, sensing her brother's determination, sighed and stood up. "I'll go with you, but if this gets too creepy, I'm out." "I'll go too," Ryan added eagerly. "Sarah." Sarah hesitated, then shook her head with a small smile. "You guys are crazy. I'm staying here. Someone's got to keep an eye on the fire." Emma glanced at her friends, seeing the excited expressions on their faces. and for a moment she felt a pang of doubt. They were all so sure of themselves, so eager to explore the unknown, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was waiting for them in the darkness. Still, she didn't want to be the one to ruin their fun. "All right," Emma muttered reluctantly, "but I'm not going far." With that, the group stood and began walking toward the edge of the camp, their steps crunching on the dry leaves beneath their feet. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, ghostly shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with every step they took. Emma couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at the campsite, where Sarah still sat, poking at the fire with a stick. The warmth of the campfire felt distant now, swallowed up by the vastness of the forest around them. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the more Emma's unease grew. The air seemed to thicken, growing heavier with every step. The rustling of the leaves above sounded almost like whispering voices, but when she looked around, there was no one there. No one except her friends, who were laughing and chatting without a care in the world. They didn't seem to notice the way the darkness seemed to press in on them, or the way the trees began to form shapes that almost looked like figures that seemed to move just out of the corner of her eye. "You all right, Em?" Ben asked, his voice suddenly close, startling her. "Yeah, just a little jumpy," she replied, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. They continued walking, the crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor the only sound. The moonlight grew fainter as the trees thickened, and soon they found themselves at the edge of a small clearing. In the center stood a stone structure, broken and overgrown with moss, but unmistakably the ruins they had come to find. Ben stepped forward, his voice full of excitement. "This is it! The old place. They say it's been here for centuries." Lily shivered, her arms folding across her chest. "It's bigger than I thought." Emma felt a chill creep up her spine as she looked around. There was something unsettling about the ruins. They didn't look ancient. They looked old in the way that things forgotten by time often did, like they had been left to rot for a reason. The stones were uneven, covered in moss and lichen, and the air felt damp and cold, even though the night was warm. "I think we should head back," Emma said, her voice more urgent now. "This place feels wrong." But before anyone could respond, a voice broke through the air. A voice that was so familiar, so haunting, that it stopped Emma in her tracks. "Emma!" Her heart skipped a beat. It was her mother's voice, the same voice she had heard countless times growing up, the voice that had comforted her through sleepless nights and dark fears. Emma turned around, her breath catching in her throat. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The voice called again, faint and distant, but unmistakably her mother's. "Emma, help me, please." Emma took a step forward, her mind racing. "No, it's not possible. She's not here. She's at home. It's just a trick." But the voice came again, and this time it was closer, so close that it felt like her mother was standing right beside her. "Emma, please, I need you." She turned around to look at her friends, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" Ben and Lily were looking at her, confusion in their eyes. "What are you talking about?" Ben asked. "There's no one here." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine as she heard the voice again, now coming from behind her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get away from whatever was calling her, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. It sounded just like her mother, but how could it be? She was miles away from home. Suddenly, she heard it again, closer this time, so close that it made her skin crawl. Emma. Her heart was racing now, and the forest seemed to press in on her from all sides, suffocating her. The trees creaked and groaned in the wind, their branches swaying as if reaching toward her, pulling her in. "Ben," she gasped, "we need to leave, now." But Ben didn't seem to hear her. He was staring off into the trees, his face pale. I thought I heard Ryan? He shook his head, trying to clear the confusion. Guys, what's going on? Then, to Emma's horror, Ryan stepped forward with a wide grin on his face. But it wasn't Ryan. It looked like him. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his features twisted into an unnatural, mocking smile. Emma, the figure said, its voice barely a whisper, but Emma heard it clearly. I'm not who you think I am. The word sent a chill straight to her core. This isn't Ryan. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure that had once been Ryan stepped closer. It was no longer him. Not entirely. The eyes were wide and unblinking, too wide, and the grin, unnervingly exaggerated, stretched across the face like a grotesque imitation. The skin seemed stretched too thin, almost as if it could peel away at any moment, revealing something darker, something wrong beneath. Ryan? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure, her mind screaming at her that it wasn't him. She knew, deep down, that this wasn't the friend she had known for years, but she couldn't understand why or how it was happening. How could something look so much like him yet feel so alien? The thing that looked like Ryan tilted its head to the side, a mocking, exaggerated gesture that made Emma's skin crawl. It's me, Emma, it said, but the voice was wrong. It didn't sound like Ryan. It was too smooth, too detached, too hollow. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. No, you're not him. The creature grinned wider. Don't be silly, Emma. We're friends, right? Ben stepped forward, his hand outstretched as if to touch the creature. Ryan, is that really you? You're acting strange. But Ryan's, no, the creature's, laughter rang out, high-pitched and unnerving. It wasn't Ryan's laugh. It was wrong, distorted, almost unnatural. Ben froze, his eyes wide in disbelief as the creature's grin stretched even further. You're all fools, the creature said, its voice dripping with an unsettling tone. You've always been fools. I've watched you all. I know your fears, your weaknesses. It'll be too late before you realize we're everywhere. Emma could feel the blood draining from her face. She stepped backward, her feet stumbling as she tried to get away from the thing that had once been Ryan. But no matter how fast she moved, the air seemed thicker, suffocating her with every breath. The trees around them loomed like silent watchers, as if the forest itself had grown aware of their presence. Ben took a step back as well, his confusion turning to fear. What the hell is going on? Lily stepped in front of Emma, her voice shaking but trying to hold on to some semblance of control. Ryan, whoever you are, stop this. This isn't funny anymore. But the creature didn't stop. It stepped closer, and Emma could see its face contorting in a way that was both horrifying and mesmerizing, like a mask slipping off to reveal something darker, something far more ancient. Ben reached out to grab Lily's arm, his voice growing more frantic. We need to leave. Now, this isn't Ryan. It's... Suddenly, the voice that had called Emma earlier, her mother's voice, echoed again, sharp and broken. Emma, help me. It sounded like her mother was just behind her, close enough that she could almost reach out and touch her. Emma whipped around, her eyes searching the trees for any sign of her. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive darkness pressing in around them. And then it happened. The voice spoke again, but this time, it wasn't coming from behind her. It came from beneath her feet. Emma, the voice moaned, distorted, as though it were trying to crawl its way up from the depths of the earth itself. Emma's heart stopped. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, as though the ground beneath her was shifting, warping. The forest was alive in a way she hadn't understood before. It wasn't just a collection of trees and underbrush. It was watching them, listening to them. Ben jerked his head toward the clearing. This is insane. We need to go. Now. But it was too late. Lily stumbled back, eyes wide with terror. It's not just Ryan anymore. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping through the trees with a ferocity that sent the leaves scattering like pieces of paper torn from a book. The sound was deafening, a wild howling gust that drowned out all other noise for a moment. And then, in the silence that followed, something more terrifying than anything Emma had ever experienced crawled into her mind. She heard her own voice, her own desperate, frightened voice, calling to her from the darkness. "Emma!" Her body froze. It was her. It sounded just like her. But something about the tone of it was wrong. It was too soft, too sweet, too desperate. It made her blood run cold. She turned toward Ben and Lily, her eyes wide with panic. "Do you hear that? That's me, that's..." Lily shook her head, her face pale. "I can't, I just..." But then Ben cut her off. "No, I hear it. It's coming from the trees, from everywhere." Emma's pulse quickened as she strained to listen. The voice was coming from the shadows, from the darkness between the trees. It called her name again, softer this time, as though it were trying to coax her closer. "Emma, come to me." She couldn't breathe. She knew that voice. It was hers, but it wasn't hers. It was an imitation, a trap. She felt a cold sweat break out on her brow as she fought the urge to look behind her, to give in to the whispering call. The trees around them seemed to twist and move, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers, beckoning her into the darkness. The forest was alive, sentient in a way she couldn't explain. She could feel its eyes on her, its hunger. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. "Ben," Lily whispered, her voice quivering. "We need to go. Now." Ben, looking just as panicked, grabbed Lily's hand and began to pull her back toward the camp. "Come on, Emma. Let's go. It's not real. We need to stick together." Emma's legs moved before her brain could process the action. She stumbled forward, her heart hammering in her chest, but the voice that was hers, continued to whisper in the back of her mind, louder now. "Emma, Emma." As they turned to leave, the ground beneath their feet suddenly shifted again, the trees groaning with an eerie resonance that rattled their bones. It was as if the forest itself was moving, shifting its boundaries, trapping them in. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the whispering stopped. The forest went still, too still. Emma's heart thudded painfully against her ribs as she turned to look at her friends. What the hell just happened? Lily's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. That wasn't just the forest playing tricks on us. This is something else. Ben's grip on her arm tightened, his eyes scanning the dark woods. "We have to get back to the camp. Now this isn't normal. None of this is normal." As they stumbled back toward the clearing, the weight of the forest pressing down on them, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest wasn't just an ominous backdrop. It was alive, its very essence twisting and warping around them. And as they reached the clearing, she noticed something strange. The fire was out. Sarah was gone. The clearing was eerily quiet, a sharp contrast to the chaos of moments before. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the campsite, her eyes darting from one corner to another. There was no sign of Sarah, no movement, no whisper of her voice, just the flickering remnants of a dying fire and the harsh, unnatural silence of the forest around them. "Sarah?" Emma called out, her voice trembling. She stepped forward, hoping against hope that her friend was just hidden somewhere in the shadows, playing a prank. But deep down, a gnawing feeling in her stomach told her that something was horribly wrong. Lily's voice cracked as she called her name again. "Sarah? Where the hell are you?" Ben stood frozen, staring at the empty campsite, his face pale. This isn't right. She was right here, and now she's gone? It doesn't make sense." The absence of Sarah felt like a hole in the center of their group, a void that seemed to pull at the very air around them. Emma's skin prickled with unease as she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, as if the forest itself had turned its gaze on them, its hunger sharpening. "We need to find her," Emma said, her voice firm despite the panic rising in her chest. "She can't have gone far. She might be hiding, playing a joke." But Lily wasn't convinced. She shook her head. I don't think she's playing. It feels like she's gone." Ben turned to her, his eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean? You think she's—" "I don't know." Lily cut him off. "But something's not right. We need to stay together. We need to—" Suddenly, there was a sharp rustling sound from the trees, followed by a low, guttural whisper. Emma's blood ran cold. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too intentional. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. "Sarah," Emma breathed, her voice barely a whisper. The rustling grew louder, closer now, as though someone was moving through the trees just beyond the clearing. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, trying to peer into the dense shadows where the sounds seemed to come from. "Sarah?" she called again, but the words felt fragile, like they would break if she spoke too loudly. Another whisper, this one unmistakably different. Not Sarah's voice this time, but a voice she knew all too well. It was her own voice calling her name. "Emma, come closer." Emma froze. Her pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. She knew that voice. It was her voice, but twisted, distorted. It was like something was trying to mimic her, to call her into the darkness with words that should never have come from her mouth. "Emma," the voice said again, softer now, more seductive. "You know you want to come. You know you want to see her. Come closer." Ben grabbed Emma's arm, his grip tight with panic. "Don't listen to it. It's not real." But Emma's legs seemed to move of their own accord, her body drawn toward the whispering voice, a compulsion that was almost impossible to fight. Her eyes locked onto the shadows in the trees, searching for any sign of Sarah, or at least some clue of where she had gone. But all she saw were the thick, dark branches, the oppressive blackness that seemed to stretch deeper into the forest with each passing second. "Sarah?" she called again, her voice trembling. "Where are you? Please, answer me." Suddenly, the voice that sounded like her own shifted again. Now it was Sarah's voice, or something pretending to be Sarah. "Emma, help me. I'm here." A wave of nausea swept over Emma as she stumbled forward, her mind screaming at her to stop. Her hand reached out toward the darkness, almost without her consent. Ben's grip tightened around her wrist, pulling her back. "No, Emma. It's a trick. It's trying to make you believe—" But his words were cut off as a loud, sickening crack echoed through the trees. It was the sound of something breaking, something large. The trees groaned under the weight of the sound, and then, as if in response to their collective fear, the forest seemed to shift, the trees closing in tighter, the shadows growing deeper. The air grew thick, choking with the scent of decay, of something ancient and forgotten. "Run!" Ben screamed, pulling at Emma's arm, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here now!" But Emma didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet were rooted to the spot, her body betraying her as it took another step forward into the darkness. The voice, Sarah's voice, was louder now, insistent. "Come to me. You're so close, Emma." Lily screamed, her voice breaking the trance that had taken hold of Emma. "Stop it! Don't listen to it!" The moment Lily shouted, the voice changed again. No longer Sarah's, no longer Emma's, but a new voice altogether. It was deep, guttural, almost unnatural. "Join me." Emma felt her heart stop in her chest. And then, in the flickering light of the dying fire, she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, hidden in the shadows. The shape was human, but not quite. Too tall, its limbs too long, its face too obscured to make out clearly. It stood still, motionless, as if watching them. "Sarah?" Emma whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. The figure didn't respond, but Emma could feel its presence. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't anything human. It was something darker, something older than anything she had ever encountered. Without warning, the figure lunged, darting forward like a shadow in the night. Emma's scream died in her throat as the world around her seemed to implode, the darkness consuming her vision. Ben shouted something, but it was drowned out by the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears, deafening her. Then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything went silent. When Emma's eyes opened again, she was lying on the ground. The fire was out, and the world around her seemed still, too still. The shadowy figure was gone. Ben and Lily were nowhere to be seen. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching her, waiting for her next move. Emma's mind was hazy as she lay on the ground, the damp earth cold against her skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but the sense of impending doom hadn't subsided. The forest stood still, a deep, oppressive silence smothering everything. No wind, no rustle of leaves, no sounds of life at all. She pushed herself up, her limbs shaky and weak, as if the very force of the forest was draining her strength. Her head spun, and she blinked, trying to focus. The absence of Ben and Lily made the dread in her chest swell, twisting with panic. Where were they? She stumbled to her feet, her eyes scanning the void around her. The clearing was empty, no sign of her friends, not even the remnants of their fire. She thought she heard something faint, a whisper on the wind. Her name, soft, insistent, carried from the depths of the trees. "Emma!" The voice was unmistakable, like a siren call. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. But she knew better now. This wasn't Sarah. This wasn't Ben. This wasn't even her own voice. The forest was playing with her, toying with her sanity. It was trying to break her. It was trying to make her believe that everything was okay, that she could trust her senses. But she couldn't. Not anymore. Taking a deep breath, Emma turned away from the voice. She needed to get out of here. She needed to escape this madness. The very ground beneath her feet felt like it was shifting, pulling her deeper into the forest's grasp. Suddenly, she froze. Something flickered in the corner of her eye. A figure standing at the far edge of the clearing, hidden among the trees. The shape was tall, its form unnatural, a dark silhouette that twisted and warped with each passing second. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was watching her. No, it wasn't watching her. It was watching something else. Behind the figure in the farthest reaches of the forest, something stirred. Movement, barely perceptible, but enough to send a shock of fear through her. It was vast, like a living shadow, sweeping across the land, erasing all light in its wake. Then she saw it. A giant tree, ancient, gnarled, its roots sprawling out like the claws of a monstrous beast. It pulsed with a faint, eerie light. The tree seemed to throb with life, as if something, someone, was trapped inside it. She could feel the oppressive weight of its gaze upon her, though it wasn't a literal gaze. It was the forest itself, its heartbeat, its breath. Her eyes widened in realization. The skinwalkers. They weren't hunting them. They were trying to escape. Escape from the thing buried in the heart of the forest. And now Emma understood the truth. The forest was not just a place. It was a prison, a trap. It had been built by something ancient and terrible, something far older than the skinwalkers. These shapeshifters were nothing more than victims, caught in the web of this place. They mimicked voices, tried to lure others to their deaths, because it was the only way they could survive. They weren't predators. They were trapped. A sudden, sharp cry broke through the silence, and Emma spun around. It was Sarah's voice, distorted, choked with terror. "Emma, please, help me!" It came from deeper within the forest. Without thinking, Emma ran. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning with exhaustion as she sprinted toward the sound of Sarah's voice. The trees seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing longer, stretching like tendrils, trying to pull her into their embrace. But Emma fought against them, using all her strength to keep going. Finally, she reached the edge of a clearing. The sight that greeted her froze her in place. There, in the center of the clearing, stood Sarah. But not Sarah as she remembered. This Sarah was different. Her body was gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now dark, sunken, and hollow. She was standing motionless, her head tilted slightly as she stared at Emma with an unnerving, unnatural calm. "Sarah?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The figure smiled, but it wasn't Sarah's smile. It was something else, something twisted. The voice that followed was far from Sarah's, but it was so close to being her own. "You should have stayed away, Emma," the thing said, its voice deep and hollow. "Now you're here, just like the others." Suddenly, Emma realized the horrifying truth. The voice wasn't just mimicking Sarah, it was mimicking her. She was trapped in a cycle, a loop of endless confusion and despair. The forest, the skinwalkers, even the twisted figure that had once been Sarah, they were all part of the same monstrous puzzle. A rustling sound broke her from her trance. From behind the figure, Ben emerged, but he wasn't the Ben she knew. He was something else. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a desperate hunger. "Ben?" Emma cried, reaching out. "Ben, please!" But he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at her, his gaze empty and lost. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper escaped his lips, but it wasn't words. It was a low, primal growl. The skinwalkers were no longer just mimicking voices. They were becoming the very thing they had been trying to escape, their true, monstrous selves. And as Emma stood there, surrounded by the creatures of the forest, a realization hit her harder than anything she'd ever experienced. She had to make a choice. Escape was no longer an option. She was bound to this place now, part of its curse, just like the others. The skinwalkers had been trying to free themselves from this nightmare. But now it was her turn to make a choice, become part of the forest's twisted soul, or join the others trapped within it. The figure of Sarah grinned again, that same twisted smile spreading across her face, and Emma could feel the pull, the allure of becoming one with the forest. The darkness, the whispers, the beckoning cold, all of it called to her. But deep within her, Emma still had a flicker of defiance. She was not going to let the forest claim her. With every ounce of strength, Emma ran forward, into the depths of the darkening woods, leaving behind the twisted versions of her friends. Her breath came in short bursts, her limbs aching, but she pushed on, determined to escape the grip of the darkness. And in the distance, she thought she saw it, the faintest glimmer of light, shining like a beacon. Maybe there was a way out after all. But with each step, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her. The forest was still. The wind had stilled. The whispers had ceased. And somewhere in its depths, the last remnants of the skinwalkers waited, trapped in the never-ending cycle. Somewhere, in the heart of the grove, Emma's name would be whispered by the trees, carried on the wind. But no one would answer. The forest had claimed its newest soul.
We made it to the end, but the terror doesn't stop here. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. If you enjoyed the story, share it with a friend, and let's see who else can survive our next nightmare.